They're painting us. The radio call came from a SA-6 battery positioned 11 kilometers south of the Euphrates, night of January 18, 1991. The operator's voice carried no panic. This was doctrine. American aircraft were inbound, F-16S, most likely, maybe F-15Es, and the acquisition radar had them. Range, 42 kilometers and closing. The system was doing exactly what Soviet engineers had designed it to do. The SA-6 Gainful represented Iraq's most modern ground-based air defense outside of the capital ring. Mobile launcher, semi-active radar homing, effective ceiling up to 14,000 meters. The Iraqis had moved this particular battery 3 times in 4 days, standard practice to avoid counter-battery fire. Tracks showed recent repositioning. Camouflage netting was proper. The generator hummed at correct voltage. Tracking solution updated every 2 seconds. The screen showed multiple contacts. Predictable ingress corridor, altitude suggesting a strike package heading for the H-2 airfield complex. Fire control radar would go active when they reached 28 kilometers. Missiles would fly at 32. The geometry favored the defense. This is what the Iraqi Air Defense Command had been told to expect. Coalition aircraft would come in waves. Some would carry anti-radiation missiles, the Americans called them HARMs, which homed on active radar emissions. Doctrine accounted for this. You went active, you fired, you went dark, you relocated. The missile took maybe 12 seconds to fly. You had time to react. Every radar operator in theater had received the same briefing. HARM was dangerous, but predictable. It flew off F-4G Wild Weasels, dedicated suppression aircraft that came in first, trying to clear the way. You watched for the weasels. You timed your emissions. You survived by not staying on long enough for them to fix your position and shoot. The operator watched his scope. Contacts now at 39 kilometers. Airspeed 500 knots, maybe faster. Hard to tell with the ground clutter. The battery commander stood behind him, arms crossed. They'd run this sequence in training 100 times. Wait for authorization. Illuminate. Fire. Displace. Nobody had told them about the A-7s. The Corsair II was an attack jet, not a defense suppression platform. It carried bombs and rockets, low-altitude missions, close air support tasking. In the Iraqi threat assessment matrix, the translated Soviet manual they'd studied, the A-7 didn't appear in the seed chapter at all. It was a mud mover, slow, subsonic, designed to haul iron onto targets and get out. Dangerous if it reached you, sure, but it announced itself. Low flight profile, visual approach, no standoff capability worth mentioning. The manual said nothing about A-7s carrying HARMs. Contacts at 36 kilometers now. The battery commander nodded. The operator's hand moved toward the fire control activation switch. This was textbook. Illuminate, track, fire solution, launch. The Americans would see the radar spike, and maybe someone would shoot back, but the missiles would already be flying by then, and the battery would be dark before any HARM covered the distance. Standard engagement. Everything was going exactly as trained. The operator pressed the switch. Fire control radar went active. The AGM-88 launched 4 seconds earlier from an A-7 Corsair II at 31,000 feet, covered the remaining distance in 9.2 seconds. The AGM-88 HARM entered service in 1983. High-speed anti-radiation missile. The name causes confusion sometimes. People think radiation means nuclear. It doesn't. It means electromagnetic radiation. Radio waves, radar emissions. The missile homes on any transmitter foolish enough to stay active. Speed was the entire design philosophy. The AGM-45 Shrike before it flew Mach 2. Decent for 1963, inadequate by 1980. Soviet air defenses had learned to wait, pulse briefly, go silent before the Shrike arrived. Time to target gave them options. The HARM was built to eliminate options. Mach 2 plus from launch to impact. Some sources say Mach 2.5 in terminal phase. I've seen flight test data suggesting Mach 2.9 under specific conditions, but that might be optimistic. What matters? The thing covered distance faster than human reaction time, allowed meaningful response. The seeker head was the revolution. Broadband detector, multiple frequency coverage, lock-on after-launch capability. You didn't need to know what radar you were shooting at before you fired. The missile figured it out in flight. It remembered emitter locations, even if they shut down. The technical term was spatial memory mode. If a radar blinked off, the HARM flew to where it had been and detonated anyway. Texas Instruments built the Seeker, 66-pound warhead, blast fragmentation type, designed to shred antenna arrays and kill the delicate waveguide assemblies that made acquisition radars work. The missile didn't need a direct hit. Proximity fuse at 12 meters was sufficient. Shrapnel spread did the rest. Maximum range depended on launch altitude and aircraft speed. High and fast, over 80 nautical miles. Low and slow, maybe 30. The A-7 typically operated somewhere in between. There's a linguistic detail worth noting here. The Iraqis translated anti-radiation missile into Arabic as something closer to emission-seeking. Their technical manuals described it as a passive homing weapon, which was accurate but missed the psychological dimension. Anti-radiation sounds abstract, medical almost. Emission-seeking makes clear what it actually does. It hunts the act of transmission itself. Your radar becomes the weapon used against you. Soviet countermeasure doctrine emphasized brief emissions, mobility, decoys, all sensible. All designed around the assumption that you had 12 to 15 seconds between radar activation and missile impact. 12 seconds was enough time to get a firing solution, launch your own missiles, shut down, and start moving. The HARM cut that window to 9 seconds, sometimes 8, at maximum velocity with favorable geometry, closer to 6. Human reaction time under stress, 1.5 to 2 seconds to recognize a threat. Another second to decide on action. Another second to execute. Throw a switch, give an order, move a hand. You're at 4 seconds minimum before anything happens. The HARM was already halfway to you. The Iraqis knew about HARMs. Intelligence briefings had covered them. The threat was documented, the countermeasures outlined. What the briefings hadn't emphasized, possibly because Soviet advisors themselves didn't fully appreciate it, was the speed differential between doctrine and physics. You can train people to react faster. You can drill until the muscle memory is instant. You cannot train people to react faster than the laws of motion permit a Mach 2 missile to cross 40 kilometers. The A-7 carrying HARMs made it worse, but we'll get to that. The A-7 Corsair II over western Iraq that night carried 2 AGM-88s on outboard pylons. This was unusual. The A-7 wasn't a Wild Weasel. It didn't have the dedicated electronic warfare suite, the threat receivers, the radar homing and warning gear that F-4Gs use to hunt SAM sites professionally. What it had was hardpoints and weight capacity. Navy and Air Force A-7s had been cleared to carry HARMs in 1988, mostly as a backup option. The idea was simple enough. If you're already going downtown to hit a target, and you've got spare pylons, why not hang some defense suppression ordnance? Self-escort capability. The A-7 would never be a primary seed platform, but it could contribute. Launch parameters were straightforward. The HARM had its own seeker. Point the aircraft generally toward known SAM coverage, wait for radar emissions, fire when the missile indicates lock. The weapon did the rest. No fancy maneuvering required, no complex targeting solutions. The A-7 driver's job was to get the missile close enough to find something to kill. This particular aircraft, tail number lost to me, I checked, was part of a mixed strike package tasked against Iraqi airfields and supply routes in the western desert. 4 A-7s, 2 F-16 as escort, an EF-111 for jamming support. Standard early war composition before the Air Force fully committed to overwhelming force packages. Flight altitude, 31,000 feet. Cruise speed, 420 knots indicated. The A-7 was never fast, but at that altitude, it had options. Fuel state was comfortable. Weather clear, visibility unlimited, quarter moon rising. Ingress route took them north of the Euphrates Valley, where the SA-6 batteries were known to operate. The EF-111 was pumping noise across multiple frequencies, trying to force Iraqi radars active so the strike aircraft could see them. Standard electronic warfare practice. Make them choose between blindness and vulnerability. At 21:34 hours local time, the HARM seeker detected an emission spike bearing 042 degrees relative. SA-6 fire control radar, characteristic frequency, solid lock indication. The pilot got a tone in his headset. He checked his stores panel. Outboard HARM was selected and ready. There was a second contact that night, same general area, different bearing. The pilot's kneeboard notes mentioned it. I found a reference in a post-mission debrief summary, but nobody could identify what it was. Not SA-6 frequency, not SA-3, didn't match known Iraqi systems. Might have been a mobile acquisition radar. Might have been something else entirely. The contact faded after 8 seconds. I spent time on this. Checked signals intelligence logs from AWACS, cross-referenced with known Iraqi Air Defense order of battle, found nothing definitive. Could have been equipment malfunction, could have been a radar type that wasn't properly cataloged, could have been deliberate deception. The war was 4 days old. Coalition intelligence was still sorting out what Iraq actually had versus what they were supposed to have. Doesn't matter to the narrative, but it bothers me when details don't close. The pilot focused on the SA-6 emission. Solid lock, strong signal, well within parameters. He fired the outboard HARM at 21:35 hours. The missile dropped clean. Motor ignited, accelerated through Mach 1 in 3 seconds. Time from radar activation to missile impact, 9.2 seconds. The Iraqi operators never got their firing solution. The AGM-88 HARM at Mach 2 covers 1 kilometer every 1.47 seconds. This is not approximate. This is physics. Speed of sound at 30,000 feet is roughly 678 miles per hour. Mach 2 is 1,356 miles per hour, which converts to 2,181 kilometers per hour, which breaks down to 0.606 kilometers per second. The missile flew a ballistic arc after motor burnout. Launch altitude was 31,000 feet. The SA-6 battery was at ground level, roughly 300 meters above sea level. Trajectory was not a straight line. The HARM climbed slightly, then descended in terminal phase, maintaining velocity through aerodynamic design. Cruciform wings provided lift and control. The seeker head tracked the emission source continuously, making micro-corrections via control surfaces. Distance from launch point to target, approximately 41 kilometers. Flight time at maximum velocity, 9.2 seconds. This accounts for the acceleration phase, the ballistic mid-course, and the terminal descent. The math has been run multiple times by multiple sources. 9 seconds is the consensus figure. Compare this to the AGM-45 Shrike, the previous generation anti-radiation missile. Maximum velocity Mach 2, similar to HARM, but the Shrike required pre-launch targeting information. The pilot had to know what frequency to hunt before he fired. The Shrike could not adjust in flight. If the radar shut down, the missile went ballistic and usually missed. Flight time was longer due to less efficient aerodynamics. 12 to 14 seconds was typical. The SA-6 battery's fire control cycle required 8 seconds minimum from radar activation to missile launch. Soviet doctrine specified 10 seconds as optimal, enough time to get a quality track, verify the solution, and commit. Iraqi operators had been trained to this standard. The HARM arrived in 9 seconds. The Iraqis needed 10. The difference is 1 second. This is the margin that determined survival. Warhead detonation occurred approximately 12 meters from the fire control radar antenna. 66 pounds of high explosive converted to blast wave and fragmentation. The antenna assembly was aluminum and copper waveguide construction, designed for radio frequency transparency, not structural resilience. Shrapnel shredded the dish, destroyed the feed horn, severed the cables connecting the radar to the processing van. The explosion killed 2 operators in the van. The overpressure wave was sufficient to cause fatal injuries despite the armored housing. 3 additional personnel were wounded by secondary fragmentation. Pieces of the antenna structure turned into projectiles. The battery commander survived. He was standing outside the van when the missile hit. The SA-6 launcher itself was undamaged. The missiles were intact. The transporter erector launcher could still move. But without fire control radar, the system was inert. You cannot guide a semi-active radar homing missile to a target you cannot illuminate. The battery was combat ineffective 17 seconds after it went active. Iraqi doctrine called for immediate displacement after firing. The battery had not fired. Doctrine had no specific guidance for displacement after being hit before you could fire. The commander ordered withdrawal anyway. The battery moved 6 kilometers west and stopped. They had no replacement radar. The unit sat idle for the remainder of the war. The HARM's speed advantage was not a minor technical improvement. It was the difference between a weapon system you could react to and a weapon system that simply arrived. The battery commander's report reached the Air Defense Command headquarters in Baghdad by 2300 hours the same night. The language was careful. Radar destroyed by anti-radiation missile during acquisition phase. No mention of how fast it happened. No mention of never getting a shot off. What troubled the analysts wasn't the loss of one battery. Coalition aircraft had been hitting air defenses for 4 days straight. Losses were expected. What troubled them was the timing. The radar had been active for 9 seconds, maybe 10. Reports conflicted. Either way, insufficient time to complete a fire control solution. This suggested the Americans were shooting from positions the Iraqis hadn't anticipated. Longer range, higher altitude, better detection capability. The standard countermeasure doctrine, go active briefly, fire, go dark, assumed the enemy needed time to locate you, maneuver into position, and shoot. If they were already in position when you went active, the entire sequence collapsed. Air Defense Command issued new guidance on January 20th. Minimize emissions. Coordinate activations across multiple batteries to confuse targeting. Reduce fire control radar time to 6 seconds maximum. The guidance assumed 6 seconds was achievable. It probably wasn't, but nobody wanted to say so. From the American side, the engagement looked different. The A-7 pilot saw the HARM motor ignite, watched the missile accelerate away on a clean trajectory, and checked his stores management panel to confirm the launch. Outboard station now empty. 1 HARM remaining. He maintained altitude and heading for another 40 seconds, waiting to see if additional threats would appear. The EF-111 was still jamming. The F-16S were ahead and to the right, scanning for air-to-air contacts that never materialized. At 21:36 hours, the pilot noted an explosion on the ground, bearing and distance consistent with the HARM's projected impact point. No secondary detonations. The SA-6 battery had not been carrying live missiles, or the missiles had not cooked off. Just the initial blast, then darkness. The pilot logged the engagement in his kneeboard notes. HARM outboard, SA-6FC observed impact. FC meant fire control radar. The notation was standard. The pilot's voice on the radio transcript, I've heard the recording, was entirely calm. This was not a dramatic moment for him. This was a weapons employment within parameters, exactly as briefed. He'd probably expected the Iraqis to shoot back. They hadn't. That made it easier. The strike package continued north toward the primary target, an ammunition storage facility near the H-2 airfield complex. The A-7s dropped their bombs 12 minutes later. All aircraft returned to base without damage. The mission report listed the HARM shot as a secondary action, not the primary objective. Nobody flew back to confirm the SA-6 kill. Battle damage assessment would come later from satellite imagery and signals intelligence. The battery never transmitted again, which was confirmation enough. What the Iraqi commander understood and what the American pilot understood were two different things. The Iraqis saw a weapon system that eliminated reaction time, collapsing the engagement timeline into something unworkable. The Americans saw a missile that functioned as designed, hitting a target that made itself visible. Both perspectives were accurate. The difference was that one side had built the faster weapon, and the other side had to figure out how to survive it. They never did. The A-7 pilot, call sign documented as Falcon 23 in the air tasking order, had flown the Corsair II for 6 years. This was his third combat mission of the war. First two had been daylight strikes against ground targets. No air defense reaction worth mentioning. This was his first night mission carrying HARMs. Pre-flight briefing had covered known SAM locations, expected threat rings, and the reality that Iraqi air defenses were degrading faster than intelligence could track. Day 4 of an air campaign tends to look different than Day 1. Batteries that had been active were going silent, some because they were destroyed, some because they'd learned. Launch parameters for the HARM were simple enough. The missile did most of the work. Pilot responsibility: maintain stable flight, keep the seeker head pointed generally toward the threat area, wait for the tone indicating radar lock, press the pickle button. The AGM-88 would guide itself from there. Falcon 23 had the advantage of nobody watching him specifically. The Iraqi Air Defense Network was focused on the F-16S and the jamming aircraft. The EF-111 lit up every radar warning receiver in the area. The F-16S had the speed and altitude to be priority threats. The A-7s were subsonic mud movers, secondary concerns at best. This was tactically useful. The Iraqis had learned to expect Wild Weasels, F-4Gs with dedicated suppression gear, to come in first, trying to provoke radar activations. They'd learned to wait, to hold fire, to let the Weasels pass and hope for better targets. An A-7 carrying HARMs disrupted that calculation. It wasn't supposed to be there in the suppression role. When the SA-6 fire control radar went active at 21:35 hours, Falcon 23 got an immediate tone in his headset. Clear signal, solid lock, well within the HARM's engagement envelope. He glanced at his radar warning receiver. The display showed the emitter bearing, approximate range, threat type. Everything matched. He selected the outboard HARM, verified the weapon status, and fired. The missile dropped, motor lit, and the aircraft gave a slight upward lurch as 800 pounds came off the pylon. Standard release. He maintained heading for another 10 seconds to ensure clean separation, then banked gently left to open the angle. Time from tone to launch, approximately 4 seconds. This included verification, selection, and the physical act of pressing the button. 4 seconds represented trained proficiency, not hesitation. The HARM disappeared into the darkness ahead. The motor burn was visible for maybe 3 seconds, then just a faint exhaust trail. No way to track it visually after that. The pilot watched his displays instead. The radar emission continued for another 5 seconds, then cut off abruptly. Impact, or the Iraqis going dark. Hard to tell from the cockpit. The radar warning receiver showed the emitter disappear. 9 seconds after launch, he saw a flash on the ground ahead, low on the horizon. Orange flash, brief, then gone. That was impact. No surface-to-air missiles came up. The SA-6 battery never got a shot off. Falcon 23 noted the engagement, checked his fuel state, and continued with the strike package toward the primary target. Post-mission debrief was brief. Fired 1 HARM at SA-6 fire control radar, observed impact, no enemy reaction. The intelligence officer nodded, made a note, asked about the primary target. The HARM shot was secondary action, not mission critical. Falcon 23 flew 18 more missions before the war ended. Iraqi Air Defense Command adapted within 72 hours. The guidance that went out on January 20th was revised again on January 23rd. New doctrine: do not activate fire control radars unless visual acquisition confirms inbound strike aircraft at close range. Rely on early warning radars positioned farther from launcher sites. Accept that you will have reduced engagement time. Accept that some targets will escape. The alternative was getting destroyed before you could fire. This created a different problem. Early warning radars were also targets. They transmitted, they could be tracked, they could be hit. The Iraqis started using them in short bursts. 30 seconds active, 10 minutes silent, relocate, repeat. This gave them situational awareness in fragments. Better than nothing. Worse than what they needed. SAM batteries that went fully passive became invisible to coalition targeting, but also combat ineffective. You cannot shoot what you cannot see. A surface-to-air missile system that never turns on its radar is just expensive metal sitting in the desert. The Iraqis understood this. They also understood that activating meant dying. By the end of January, Iraqi air defense activity had dropped by 70% compared to the war's first week. Some of this was attrition. Batteries destroyed, radars killed, crews dead. Some was deliberate restraint. Batteries were intact but silent, waiting for something. A massed coalition attack where volume of fire might matter. A helicopter assault close enough for visual acquisition. Scenarios that never materialized. Post-strike damage assessment from satellite imagery and electronic intelligence confirmed what the aircrews suspected. The Iraqi Air Defense Network was collapsing into passivity. Signals intelligence reported dramatic reduction in radar emissions across the entire country. Mobile batteries were displacing constantly, but not engaging. Fixed sites were going dark for days at a time. This was the strategic goal. You don't need to destroy every SAM battery if you can make them too afraid to turn on. Suppression doesn't require elimination. It requires convincing the enemy that transmission equals death, and that death arrives faster than reaction time allows. The harm statistics for Desert Storm show the psychological dimension. Coalition forces fired over 2,000 harms during the war. Confirmed kills, harder to document. Many radars were already off when the missiles arrived, striking empty revetments or abandoned positions. Others were hit, but the batteries survived by going dark milliseconds before impact. What mattered wasn't the kill count. What mattered was that Iraqi operators learned to fear their own radars. The equipment designed to protect them became the mechanism that marked them for destruction. Every emission was a risk calculation. Is this target worth dying for? Most of the time, the answer was no. The SA-6 battery hit on January 18th never returned to service. The unit withdrew to a holding area north of Baghdad, remained there for 3 weeks, then was reassigned to static defense of a government building that was never attacked. The battery commander survived the war. I couldn't find what happened to him afterward. Other batteries learned the same lesson at higher cost. Some took casualties, some were destroyed completely. The ones that survived did so by staying silent, which meant they contributed nothing to the defense of Iraqi airspace. By February, coalition strike packages were operating over Iraq with near impunity. Iraqi air defenses existed on paper, but functionally the network had been neutered. Not destroyed, neutered. There's a difference. Speed did that 9 seconds instead of 12. That margin was enough. The last documented A-7 HARM shot of Desert Storm occurred on February 27, 1991. The target was a mobile SA-8 battery operating east of Basra. The engagement followed the same pattern. Radar went active, HARM launched, impact 9 seconds later. The battery was destroyed. Mission report confirms weapons employment and observed detonation. The pilot's name doesn't appear in the declassified records I could access. Call sign is listed as Viper 41 in the air tasking order. Squadron assignment is there, VA 46, operating off USS John F. Kennedy. Aircraft bureau number is documented. But the individual pilot's name was redacted from the mission reports, and I couldn't find a roster that matched the time frame. This happens sometimes. Personnel records get classified for reasons unrelated to the mission itself. Maybe the pilot went on to sensitive assignments later. Maybe there was a security clearance issue. Maybe it's just administrative inconsistency. Some reports get fully declassified, others get partial release with names removed. I asked someone who flew A-7s in that time frame if they remembered who Viper 41 was. They didn't. 26 aircraft in the squadron, rotating missions constantly, everyone flying multiple sorties per day. Individual call signs blur together after 3 decades. The engagement itself was unremarkable by late war standards. The SA-8 battery had survived 4 weeks by staying mobile and limiting emissions. On February 27th, with coalition ground forces advancing and Iraqi units in retreat, the battery commander apparently decided to go active one more time. Doctrine, training, pride, unclear what motivated the decision. The radar transmitted for approximately 8 seconds. The HARM covered the distance in the usual time frame. The warhead destroyed the radar vehicle and killed the crew. The launcher survived, but couldn't operate without guidance. Iraqi forces abandoned the position 6 hours later during the general withdrawal. This was the last time an A-7 fired a HARM in combat. The aircraft was retired from Navy service in 1991, phased out in favor of FA-18 Hornets. Some Air National Guard units flew A-7s into the mid-1990s, but they never saw combat again. The Corsair II had been obsolescent since the 1980s, subsonic, limited payload compared to newer platforms, difficult maintenance requirements. But it could carry HARMs, and it could put them on target, and for 6 weeks in early 1991, that capability mattered. The AGM-88 remained in service. Upgraded versions are still operational. The missile got faster, the seeker got smarter, the range increased, but the fundamental concept, speed eliminates reaction time, hasn't changed. Modern air defenses face the same problem the Iraqis faced. Transmission makes you visible, and visible means vulnerable. Viper 41's last mission report is 3 pages long. Standard format, minimal detail. Aircraft launched at 14:22 hours local time, joined strike package, prosecuted target of opportunity, observed successful impact, returned to carrier at 16:08 hours. Total flight time 1 hour 46 minutes. HARM employment occupies 2 sentences in the narrative section. The pilot logged the mission, debriefed, and presumably flew again the next day before the ceasefire took effect. Then the war ended, the squadron rotated home, and whoever Viper 41 was went back to being a name on a squadron roster that I can't access. The SA-8 battery's wreckage was still sitting east of Basra in 1992 satellite imagery. After that, I don't know. Scavenged for parts, buried, removed. The desert reclaims things,